Welcome to another deep dive today. We're going to be tackling something today that's,
Pretty juicy.
yeah, pretty juicy. It's really crucial for anyone who's, either gone to college or university in Ontario or is maybe thinking about it.
hmm
And that is how these institutions are funded.
Yeah, it's super relevant right now, actually. Ontario is actually planning like a whole revamp, a complete overhaul of its post-secondary funding model by 2027, 2028. So we're really lucky to have some pretty good info to kind of dig into today. We've got this research paper by Dr. Andre De Freitas. He's not only examined the current system and its history, but also laid out some really, really intriguing alternatives.
So before we kind of get into these potential shakeups, can you kind of set the stage for us a little bit? How has Ontario funded its post-secondary institutions in the past?
Well, prior to the 1990s, it was a pretty hands-off approach. Institutions basically got like a fixed amount of money every year, regardless of how many students they had or like what they achieved.
It sounds almost too simple.
Yeah.
What were some of the
Very.
problems with that system?
Yeah, you can imagine it wasn't exactly the best at encouraging, excellence or responsiveness to the changing needs of students or the economy. There wasn't really much incentive for institutions to innovate or think about student outcomes.
Right. So enter the enrollment-based funding model in 1996. Seems like a logical shift. Tie funding to the number of students you have. But did this solve the problem?
Well, it did address some of the issues, but then, of course, some new ones kind of cropped up. Institutions became vulnerable to these fluctuations in enrollment, which can be influenced by, all sorts of factors, like outside of their control, demographics or economic downturns, things like that.
Yeah, and it seems like this model maybe even created a bit of a race to the bottom, with some institutions focusing more on just attracting students rather than providing a high-quality education,
Yeah.
that really prepares them for the workforce.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And here's a stat that might surprise you. Despite this enrollment-based model, Ontario actually has the lowest per student funding in all of Canada. Yeah. We're talking significantly below the national average.
That's pretty alarming.
Hmm.
It's no wonder that tuition fees have become such a burden for students and their families.
Exactly. And this over-reliance on tuition, especially from international students, is creating a whole other set of challenges, both for the institutions and the province's overall economic well-being.
So we've got a system that's maybe not exactly thriving here. We're dealing with declining domestic enrollment, rising operational costs for universities and colleges, and this dependence on international student tuition, which is starting to look a little shaky.
Right. And on top of that, there's a growing concern that the skills graduates are learning aren't really aligning with what employers need.
Right.
It's almost like we're training people for jobs that don't exist while we're neglecting these areas where there's real demand.
So this is where Dr. DeFreitas' research really comes in. He's outlined like 4 alternative funding models that are, trying to address these challenges. I'm ready to dive in. Where do we start?
Okay, let's begin with what he calls the enhanced enrollment-based model. So this is actually the most similar to our current system, but with some, key tweaks to try and, boost stability and fairness.
Okay, so sounds like an evolution rather than a revolution. Walk me through it.
So the most significant change is that there would be a substantial increase in the base funding per student. But it's not just about, throwing more money at the problem.
Right, there has to be more to it than that. How do they make sure that money is being used effectively?
Well, he proposes these stability and equity grants that would basically give institutions extra funding if they face unique challenges. So think, rural and northern institutions and those with large populations of underrepresented students.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, a one-size-fits-all approach obviously wouldn't work in a province as diverse as Ontario.
Hmm?
What else is part of this model?
There's also a strategic investment fund, and this would support, key priorities across the whole system. So this could be funding for things like innovative learning technologies,
Right.
improving accessibility, or even upgrading infrastructure.
Okay, so option 1 is about giving institutions more upfront resources,
Yeah.
making the system more stable and equitable. But what are the potential downsides?
I think the biggest concern is that it doesn't fully address that declining enrollment problem.
Yeah.
Critics argue that it might not be enough of a change to make the system, truly sustainable in the long run.
So on to option 2 then. What's the big idea with this one?
All right, so this is where we start to see a real shift in the philosophy. Option 2, the performance and equity-based model, it kind of moves away from relying just on enrollment numbers and puts more emphasis on what institutions are actually accomplishing.
Okay, so less about how many students you have and more about what those students are learning and achieving.
Exactly. So while the base per student funding is a bit lower in this model, there's a significant portion tied directly to performance metrics. So we're talking, things like graduate employment rates, the quality and impact of the research being produced, about $1.75 billion.
So institutions that are really preparing their graduates for the workforce and contributing to cutting-edge research,
Yeah.
they would stand to benefit the most from this.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But there's still a strong emphasis on equity. So Dr. DeFreitas is proposing this equity adjustment fund to support institutions that primarily serve marginalized students.
So it seems like Dr. DeFreitas is really trying to thread the needle here, balancing the need to encourage excellence with the need to make sure that everyone has access to a high-quality education.
Absolutely. And then there's also the Workforce Alignment Fund, and that would specifically target programs that are designed to address these critical labor market needs. So think, job training programs, apprenticeships, co-op placements, things that directly connect students with the skills employers are looking for.
This model seems to be geared toward making post-secondary education more responsive to the needs of the economy. Not just churning out graduates without thinking about where they're going to fit in. What are the potential drawbacks of this approach?
One concern is that it could actually exacerbate existing inequalities. So institutions that already have more resources and a stronger track record, they're more likely to perform well on these metrics. And it could potentially widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a gamble. It could push everyone towards excellence, but it could also leave some institutions behind.
That's a crucial point. And it leads us to option 3, which tries to address some of these concerns with a more balanced approach.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's option 3 all about?
Option 3, the hybrid model with sector prioritization. It tries to find this sweet spot between funding based on enrollment, making sure there's institutional stability, and supporting key economic development goals.
It sounds like it's trying to be all things to all people. How does that actually work in practice?
Okay, so the per-student funding in this model falls somewhere between option 1 and option 2. But there's a significant targeted excellence fund that rewards institutions for excelling in research and innovation.
So still encouraging those things, but maybe not as intensely as option 2.
Exactly. And then there's the Workforce and Economic Development Fund, and that specifically supports programs in high-growth sectors. So think, technology, skilled trades, healthcare. It's a very targeted approach to addressing those workforce needs.
This option feels like a very pragmatic compromise.
Yeah.
Trying to strike a balance between different priorities. Who would benefit most from this model?
I think it would be particularly appealing to colleges that already prioritize, applied learning and have strong connections with industry. So institutions like George Brown or Humber come to mind.
This is getting really interesting.
Yeah.
We've got 3 very different approaches already, and I'm starting to see a pattern here. Each option seems to favor different types of institutions and different priorities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It really highlights the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. Finding the right model for Ontario is going to require really careful consideration of the strengths and weaknesses of each approach and how they might play out across, the very diverse landscape of our post-secondary system.
Okay, deep divers. We've covered 3 of Dr. DeFreitas' funding models, and each one raises some really fascinating questions. Stay tuned for part 2, where we unpack his 4th and final option. This one's a really radical idea that completely changes the game for how post-secondary funding is decided. You won't want to miss it. Welcome back, deep divers. We left off with option 3, which tried to kind of strike a balance between different priorities. But option 4 is where Dr. DeFreitas throws us a real curveball.
Yeah, he calls this one the institutional engagement model, and it really flips the script in terms of, who gets to make the big decisions about funding.
Okay, color me intrigued. What exactly does he have in mind?
Well, instead of having the government, dictate the funding formula, this model basically puts the power in the hands of the institutions themselves. So it essentially says to Colleges Ontario and the Council of Ontario Universities, you're the experts. You figure out how to best allocate the funds.
Wow. So it's a major power shift.
Yeah.
Is he suggesting we just hand over a blank check and hope for the best?
Not quite. There would still be some provincial oversight, to make sure that the funding aligns with, broad public policy goals and labor market needs. But the key difference here is that the institutions themselves would be driving the process, developing their own funding models tailored to their unique strengths and challenges.
I can see how this would appeal to institutions. It plays into that desire for more autonomy and the ability to kind of control their own destiny. But wouldn't this just lead to chaos? Like every institution just scrambling for its own piece of the pie?
Well, Dr. DeFreitas anticipates that concern. And he outlines a system that combines autonomy with accountability. So he proposes that 50% of the total funding, so we're talking $3.5 billion, would be allocated based on these institution-led proposals. The remaining 50% would be divided between, provincial oversight research workforce alignment initiatives and equity and performance funding.
Okay, so it's not a complete free-for-all. There's still a framework in place to guide the process and make sure those core priorities are addressed.
Exactly. And by giving institutions, a direct stake in the funding model, you incentivize them to think creatively and collaboratively about how to best use those resources.
Yeah, I'm starting to see the appeal of this approach.
Yeah.
It's about trusting the expertise of those on the ground and encouraging innovation within the system. But even with the best laid plans, we know things don't always go smoothly. Let's talk about implementation. Is Dr. DeFreitas just kind of throwing these ideas out there, or does he have a concrete plan for how these changes would actually be put into practice?
Oh, he's definitely not just leaving it to chance. He proposes a very methodical 4-phase implementation plan, beginning with extensive consultation and data collection.
So first and foremost, get everyone to the table to share their perspectives and concerns. Who would be involved in these consultations?
He suggests forming a task force with representatives from all the key stakeholders. So universities, colleges, the Ministry of Colleges and Universities industry experts, and crucially, student advocacy groups.
I'm glad to hear that students would have a voice in this process. I mean, after all, they're the ones who are most impacted by these decisions.
Absolutely. It's vital that student perspectives are included, and Dr. DeFreitas explicitly recommends engaging groups like the Canadian Federation of Students and the College Student Alliance.
Okay, so once they've gathered all this feedback, what's the next step?
Phase 2 focuses on developing and testing the funding models. So the task force would take all that input they've gathered and use it to create preliminary versions of the models, which would then be piloted with a select group of institutions.
It's like a trial run before the big launch.
Yeah.
What a great way to work out any kinks and make sure that the model is actually viable in a real-world setting.
Exactly. And during this pilot phase, there would be ongoing consultation and regular reports, to ensure transparency and allow for adjustments based on the data that's being collected.
This phased approach seems really smart. It allows for flexibility and course correction along the way, and it helps to build buy-in from all the stakeholders who will ultimately be responsible for making it work.
Exactly. Once the pilot phase is complete and the chosen model has been refined, phase 3 kicks in. This is where the government formally approves the new funding model and develops detailed implementation guidelines for all institutions.
So it's like creating the instruction manual for how to navigate this new system. But even with the most thorough planning, we know there will be challenges. Does Dr. DeFreitas acknowledge that?
He does. And he doesn't shy away from it. In fact, he dedicates a whole section of his paper to, potential barriers and strategies to overcome them. He really tries to anticipate the challenges and propose solutions.
Okay, let's dig into that a little. What are some of the biggest hurdles they might encounter?
Well, there's the potential for institutional resistance, especially from universities and colleges that are, comfortable with the current system or worry that these changes might threaten their financial stability.
Yeah, change is always scary, especially when it comes to something as crucial as funding. How does Dr. DeFreitas propose we overcome this resistance?
Well, he emphasizes early and continuous engagement with the institutions, making them active participants in the process rather than just imposing a new system on them. The idea is to foster a sense of ownership and collaboration.
It's like that saying, people support what they help create. If institutions feel like they have a voice in shaping the new model, they're more likely to embrace it. What about the ever-present issue of budget constraints? How do we pay for all of this?
Yeah, Dr. DeFreitas acknowledges that money doesn't grow on trees. He suggests a phased approach to funding increases, allowing institutions to adjust gradually. He also recommends exploring, innovative cost-sharing models where institutions partner with industry to support certain programs or initiatives.
That makes a lot of sense. Tap into the resources of the businesses that will ultimately benefit from a well-trained workforce. What other potential challenges does he highlight?
Well, equity is a major concern. There's a real risk that some institutions, particularly smaller colleges or those in rural and northern communities, might struggle to adapt to a new funding model.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to create a system that benefits the big players while leaving others behind. How does Dr. DeFreitas address this concern?
He proposes a robust equity adjustment fund to provide targeted support to institutions that are serving underrepresented students or facing unique geographic challenges. The idea is to really level the playing field and ensure that no institution is unfairly disadvantaged by the changes.
Okay, so we've got institutional resistance, budget limitations, and equity concerns. Anything else we need to be wary of?
Another challenge is the potential for data and performance measurement issues, particularly with models that heavily rely on performance-based funding.
Yeah, it's easy to say, we'll fund you based on your outcomes. But how do you actually measure those outcomes in a way that's accurate and fair and comparable across institutions?
That's a great question. Dr. DeFreitas suggests establishing standardized reporting frameworks for all institutions and providing them with the technical and financial support they need to collect and report data effectively.
So it's not just about setting targets, but equipping everyone with the tools they need to meet those targets and demonstrate their success. What about the human element here? Getting buy-in from all these stakeholders and navigating the complexities of policy implementation.
Yeah, that's key. Dr. DeFreitas really stresses the importance of transparency and communication throughout the process. Keep everyone informed, explain the rationale behind the changes, address concerns proactively. He also recommends a multi-year transition period with built-in flexibility to allow institutions to adapt gradually and make adjustments as needed.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint. Take the time to do it right. Listen to feedback. Be willing to course correct as you go. What about the political side of things? It's one thing to have a great plan on paper, but how do you ensure that it actually gets implemented and survives the inevitable shifts in the political landscape?
Right, that's a big factor. There's always the potential for political opposition, especially if a new government comes into power with different priorities.
Yeah, it's hard to predict which way the political winds will blow. Does Dr. DeFreitas offer any guidance on navigating that uncertainty?
He emphasizes the need to build a broad coalition of support for these changes, framing them, around shared interests and using data-driven arguments to demonstrate their value. The goal is to make it clear that this isn't about partisan politics. It's about doing what's best for Ontario's post-secondary system and its future workforce.
Okay, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the potential benefits of these new funding models to the very real challenges of putting them into practice.
Yeah, it's clear that this is a complex undertaking with high stakes. It's not about finding a perfect solution, because there probably isn't one, but rather about choosing the path that offers the most promising balance of benefits and risks.
And as we move into part 3, the question is, what will Ontario ultimately decide? Will they be bold enough to embrace a radical new approach, or will they stick with a more incremental path?
That's the question we'll explore in our final segment, where we'll delve into Dr. DeFreitas' concluding thoughts and recommendations. We'll also leave you with some provocative questions to ponder as we navigate this critical crossroads for the future of higher education in Ontario. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Ontario's post-secondary funding crossroads. We've explored 4 very different paths that Ontario could take, each with its own benefits and challenges.
And we've seen how crucial implementation is. It's not enough to just pick a new model. You need a solid plan to put it into action, anticipate those potential roadblocks, and really bring everyone along on the journey.
Exactly. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what are Dr. DeFreitas' final takeaways? Does he have any parting wisdom for policymakers and those of us who care about the future of higher ed in Ontario?
He does, and it goes beyond just picking the right model. He really stresses that this isn't a one-time fix. This is the beginning of an ongoing process.
So it's not about finding that perfect solution and calling it a day.
Yeah.
It's about creating a system that's adaptable and responsive to change.
Exactly. He recommends establishing a dedicated post-secondary funding task force, not just to oversee that initial implementation, but to continue monitoring the system's performance and making adjustments as needed.
So a kind of steering committee to guide the ship and make sure it stays on course. Who would be on this task force?
He envisions a really diverse group of stakeholders. So you'd have representatives from universities and colleges, government officials, industry experts, and of course, student advocates. It's about bringing together all those different perspectives and ensuring that everyone has a voice in shaping the future of the system.
That makes sense. Collaboration seems crucial here, especially given, the complexity of the issue and the potential for pushback from various groups. What else does he recommend?
He also emphasizes the need for long-term financial planning that's really aligned with clear workforce development strategies.
So it's not just about tinkering with the funding formula, it's about connecting the dots between education and the economy.
Exactly. He suggests that Ontario needs a comprehensive plan to ensure that its post-secondary institutions are producing graduates with the skills and knowledge that are in demand, both now and in the future.
Otherwise, we risk creating a system that's out of sync with the realities of the job market, leaving graduates ill-equipped for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Right. And he also recommends expanding those research partnerships between institutions and employers, go beyond just traditional co-op placements to create more opportunities for real-world learning and collaboration.
That makes a lot of sense. Getting businesses more involved in shaping curricula and providing those hands-on experiences for students can only benefit everyone involved.
And his final recommendation is one that I think you'll appreciate. He suggests formally integrating student advocacy organizations into the governance structure of the post-secondary system.
Now, that's an interesting idea. It's not just about consulting with students. It's about giving them a permanent seat at the table where decisions are being made.
Exactly. He argues that students are the ultimate stakeholders in the post-secondary system, and their voices need to be heard, not just as a courtesy, but as a fundamental part of the decision-making process.
Well said. So we've explored Dr. DeFreitas's recommendations, and it's a pretty comprehensive vision for how Ontario can create a more sustainable, equitable, and outcome-driven post-secondary system.
But it's important to remember that this is just one perspective. There are many other voices in this conversation, each with their own ideas and priorities.
Exactly. We've presented you with a deep dive into one expert's analysis, but we encourage you to do your own research, form your own opinions, and engage in this really crucial conversation.
We've linked to Dr. DeFreitas's research in the show notes, and we encourage you to explore it further.
So deep divers, as we wrap up this episode, we leave you with a few questions to consider. Which funding model resonates most with you, and why? What are your hopes and concerns about the future of post-secondary education in Ontario?
And what role do you think you can play in shaping that future?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked some new ideas and inspired you to engage in this really vital conversation about the future of higher education. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.